The Caribbean sun rose like a slow-burning fuse over the rim of the sea, casting a molten glow across the crests of the waves and illuminating the first ships that dared sail those waters centuries ago. Long before Hollywood invented its swaggering tricksters and cursed treasure hunters, the real pirates of the Caribbean carved their legends into the timber of empire. Their world was not one of whimsical comedy or magical compasses, but of hunger, ambition, vengeance, and opportunity. It was a world where the line between merchant and marauder was as thin as the breeze that filled a sail. And though most of what the modern world remembers has been polished into stories fit for movie screens, the truth is far more brutal, far more fascinating, and far more human. It begins not with a single pirate, but with a transformation, an entire region morphing into the most profitable and dangerous stretch of water on Earth. The Caribbean in the 17th century was a place where greed met geography. Spain claimed it by divine right, or so they believed, planting their banners on islands and mainland shores, digging mines, building forts, and hauling wealth across the Atlantic by the ton. Gold and silver poured from the Americas back into Europe. Sugar plantations, fueled by enslaved African labor, produced unimaginable fortunes. Yet Spain's vast empire was fragile, stretched thin, and surrounded by rivals who envied and resented their supposed monopoly on the New World. Those rivals, England, France, and the Netherlands, could not openly wage constant war without bankrupting themselves. Instead, they turned to a different strategy. They loosened leashes around men who were half sailors, half mercenaries, and entirely dangerous. These were privateers, armed with government permission to raid Spanish ships and settlements. A slip of paper, called a letter of marque, transformed a criminal into a patriot, at least temporarily. But once the wars ended, these same men found themselves without legal justification, yet still possessing the skills, the weapons, and the appetites that had made them feared. Many simply refused to stop. And thus, the Caribbean became a sanctuary for those who lived beyond the reach of law. When imagining the first real pirates of the Caribbean, picture not choreographed sword fights but rough hands, salt-crusted skin, rotting planks, and a constant battle against hunger, scurvy, and storms. Their lives were desperate long before they became legendary. But desperation can breed courage and recklessness, and these men used both to reshape the destiny of nations. Their stories, real ones, are more gripping than fiction and far worthier of being remembered. Whether you're already fascinated by maritime history or just discovering the real world behind the fantasy, this deep dive into the truth of Caribbean piracy will reveal how ordinary sailors became rebels, kings without crowns, and nightmares to empires. And if you enjoy learning about these forgotten histories, consider sticking around, subscribing, liking, or just supporting more long-form stories like this, so we can keep exploring the corners of the past that Hollywood likes to decorate but rarely explain. For now, let's continue. Long before figures like Blackbeard terrorized the seas, another breed of outlaw had already filled Spanish governors with dread. They were called the buccaneers, though the name originally had nothing to do with piracy. On the island of Hispaniola, French and English hunters who roasted meat on wooden frames called boucans were known as buccaneers. They lived in rugged independence, surviving by selling smoked meat to passing ships. Spain tried repeatedly to drive them off the land, burning their camps and releasing war dogs to hunt them. Instead of fleeing, many buccaneers chose a more profitable revenge. They took to the sea. With knowledge of the coastline, an ability to survive in harsh conditions, and a deep hatred of Spanish rule, these early sea rovers became the foundation upon which later pirate legends were built. They had no allegiance except to each other. And unlike European naval forces with rigid hierarchies, the buccaneers ran their operations more democratically. Crews voted on plans, shared the spoils equally, and held captains accountable. This sense of equality was intoxicating to men who had been treated as disposable labor aboard merchant or naval vessels. It also gave them an edge. A crew that felt respected fought harder, rowed faster, and risked more than one, operating under fear and punishment. The island of Tortuga, off the coast of Hispaniola, became their headquarters. With steep cliffs, hidden coves, and a near-constant stream of ships passing nearby, it was the perfect pirate nest. Tortuga's population was a mix of outcasts, runaway servants, escaped slaves, deserters from European navies, freebooters looking for fortune, and bold women who carved out their own lives in a male-dominated world. Taverns overflowed with rum, gunpowder smoke, and the smell of roasting meat. Deals were made in the shadows. Alliances shifted with the tides. And beyond the island's shores, the Spanish treasure fleets continued their journeys like lambs before wolves. From this crucible emerged some of the earliest pirate leaders whose names still echo faintly through history. Men like Francois l'Olonais, whose brutality became infamous even among his own kind, and Henry Morgan, who would rise from outlaw to knighted governor. But before their tales take center stage, the political context must be understood, for piracy did not happen in isolation. Every raid, every ambush, every burning settlement was part of a larger struggle between European superpowers. Spain considered all foreign presence in the Caribbean to be illegal, and they responded with ruthless punishment. Yet their empire was simply too vast to patrol effectively. Their treasure fleets followed predictable seasonal routes, making them tempting targets. When France and England encouraged privateers to harass Spanish interests, they sparked a cycle of violence that turned the Caribbean into the world's most dangerous oceanic battlefield. Spanish reprisals grew harsher, privateers grew bolder, and as peace treaties came and went, the line between national service and outright piracy blurred. Imagine a young sailor from Bristol or Rowan signing up for a voyage, hoping for prize money or adventure, only to find himself years later living on Tortuga, armed with a cutlass, bound by small democratic rituals among thieves, and preparing to assault a Spanish fortress. These transformations were common. Many pirates began as ordinary workers, fishermen, carpenters, sailors escaping cruel captains, fugitives avoiding hanging. In a world where survival depended on risk, piracy offered a strange promise. Danger, yes, but also autonomy, equality, and potential riches beyond anything a laborer could dream of. This mixture of desperation and opportunity produced figures like Francois l'Olonais. Born Jean David now, he arrived in the Caribbean as an indentured servant, essentially a disposable laborer purchased by a landowner. After surviving his term, he turned to buccaneering. His hatred for the Spanish was legendary. According to accounts, he once survived a shipwreck near a Spanish settlement by smearing himself with the blood of dead crewmates and hiding among their bodies until nightfall. The story may be exaggerated, but it captures the aura he cultivated, one of terror so intense that Spanish troops sometimes fled at the sight of his ship's flag. He led raids across the Caribbean, committing atrocities that even other pirates found unsettling. Yet his brutality was effective. Towns surrendered rather than face his wrath. Spanish convoys altered their routes to avoid him, and although his life ended violently in Central America, rumored to have been torn apart by indigenous warriors, his legend influenced generations of pirates after him. But the most famous buccaneer of all was Henry Morgan. Unlike l'Olonais, Morgan combined cruelty with strategy, ambition, and political instincts that lifted him beyond mere outlawry. Born in Wales, he arrived in the Caribbean amid the chaos of competing empires. Morgan mastered the art of privateering, launching increasingly audacious attacks on Spanish cities. His most notorious raid was on Panama City in 1671. He gathered a massive force of buccaneers, marched them through jungle terrain despite starvation and disease, and confronted a fortified Spanish garrison. The battle was fierce, the city burned, and the plunder was enormous. Although Spain protested, England quietly approved. Morgan became a hero, knighted by King Charles Roman II, and eventually served as Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica. He went from pirate to politician, an astonishing transformation that Hollywood rarely portrays with accuracy. Morgan's rise also marked the beginning of a shift. Once piracy became too disruptive to trade, even the nations that had encouraged privateering needed order restored. Plantation wealth required stability, not chaos. Merchant fleets needed protection, not competition. And governors could no longer look the other way when piracy threatened their own profits. The age of buccaneers began to wane, although the age of golden era pirates had yet to dawn. Still, the Caribbean remained a patchwork of opportunity for those willing to defy law and empire. A young sailor tarring the deck of a ship might hear rumors of a Spanish galleon heavy with silver. A runaway slave on Jamaica might learn of an outlaw community where escapees could find freedom among thieves. A navigator tired of naval discipline might slip away from his commander and join a pirate crew promising equal shares and democratic votes. The avenues into piracy were varied, yet they all led to the same place, a life balanced between sudden wealth and sudden death. As you follow these stories across the next chapters, you'll notice how real piracy differs from the cinematic version. There were no cursed Aztec coins or drunken captains stumbling with comedic charm. Instead, there were codebooks, meetings, agreements, and fierce debates among crews about discipline and fairness. There were small skiffs that ambushed massive ships by surprise, boarding actions fought at terrifyingly close quarters, and towns that woke at dawn to find pirates already within their walls. There was also hardship, constant, grinding hardship. Food spoiled, water ran out. Storms destroyed entire fleets, disease killed faster than cannon fire, and yet thousands chose this life. Why? The simplest answer is freedom. A pirate ship, for all its danger, was one of the few places in the 17th century where a man could vote, speak freely, and share in collective profit. It was a floating republic at a time when most governments valued ordinary citizens primarily as taxpayers or cannon fodder. Even enslaved people who escaped to pirate crews often earned equal shares and their own weapons, a level of autonomy violently denied elsewhere. As the Caribbean world of the 17th century evolved, new pirate havens emerged. Port Royal in Jamaica became infamous as a bustling, chaotic hub of commerce, smuggling, and indulgence. The town was so soaked in rum and vice that one clergyman called it the Sodom of the New World. Pirates could sail into its harbor, spend their loot on gambling, fine clothes, and nights of revelry, then return to sea broke and eager for the next prize. This cycle fascinated observers and horrified moralists, but it also reinforced the cultural identity of piracy: reckless, indulgent, and defiant. However, Port Royal's reign as the wickedest city on earth ended abruptly in 1692 when a massive earthquake shattered the island, sinking much of the town beneath the sea. Survivors spoke of buildings collapsing, the earth splitting open, and people swallowed whole by the ground. It was a catastrophe that some interpreted as divine punishment. Others simply saw it as the fate of a city built on unstable sands and excessive indulgence. But with Port Royal's destruction, a shift began. The next generation of pirates would arise not from land-based dens of sin, but from the sea itself. This next generation would include some of the most iconic names in pirate history, figures whose legends have been distorted by fiction, yet whose real lives were dramatic enough to stand on their own. Before we get to them, though, we must step deeper into the Caribbean as it transformed from buccaneer territory into a battlefield for traders, empires, and renegades. The world was changing quickly. Sugar plantations expanded, wealth concentrated, the slave trade intensified. European nations signed treaties that outlawed privateering, cutting off the legal justification for many sea rovers. And yet the seas remained full of opportunity for those willing to risk their lives. As this transformation unfolded, countless forgotten pirates played small but crucial roles. Men whose names never reached history books, yet whose actions shaped local politics, attacked supply ships, disrupted colonial economies, and lived lives of radical independence. Their stories too deserve to be told, and woven among the tales of notorious captains will be glimpses into the everyday pirate, the man whose sweat and blood kept the Caribbean's outlaw world turning. So as we continue through this full series, take a moment to imagine the creak of the ship's hull beneath your feet, the sting of salt on your face, and the tension of being part of a crew with no nation, no legal protection, and no guarantee of seeing another sunrise. This is not Hollywood's Caribbean. This is the true one. And if you're enjoying this journey so far, feel free to stay with me, support the series, subscribe, like, or just follow along. It helps me bring more real stories and long-form documentaries like this to life. There is so much more ahead. The seas are wide, the winds are shifting, and the golden age of piracy is just starting to rise. The end of the buccaneer era did not silence the Caribbean. It merely changed the tone of the voices that ruled its waters. As the 17th century slid into the 18th, the region entered a new, explosive phase. The old hunters of Tortuga and the sanctioned privateers of European empires were fading away, replaced by a new breed of outlaw who owed allegiance to no king, no governor, and no nation. These were the pirates of what history now calls the Golden Age, though for those who lived through it, the term must have felt painfully ironic. It was an age golden only in the sense that it glittered briefly, burned brightly, and ended violently. To understand why piracy surged, one must look at the shifting political landscape. European wars came and went with bewildering frequency. Treaties were signed, broken, forgotten, and rewritten. One year England and France were mortal enemies. The next year they were allies of convenience. Spain tried desperately to hold onto its monopolies, while the Netherlands fought for trade supremacy. In this churn of alliances, thousands of sailors found themselves unemployed when wars ended. Naval ships were decommissioned, privateering licenses revoked, and merchant captains hired cheaper, inexperienced crews to cut costs. Experienced fighters, men who knew how to fire cannons, board ships, and navigate treacherous coasts, suddenly had no livelihood. Adding to this turmoil was the aftermath of the War of the Spanish Succession. When peace arrived in 1714, tens of thousands of hardened sailors were cast adrift without pay or prospects. What happens when you give men years of violent work, teach them naval tactics, expose them to plundered wealth, and then abruptly dismiss them? Many drifted toward the only trade they understood, one that still offered rewards for danger and disobedience. Piracy was, for some, a career of last resort. For others, it was liberation. There was also the matter of merchant ships themselves. The Caribbean trade routes boomed with sugar, coffee, tobacco, indigo, and enslaved Africans transported under horrific conditions. These ships were often undermanned, poorly armed, and heavily laden with goods worth fortunes in Europe. Pirates knew exactly which routes were rich and which ships were vulnerable. Every empire relied on maritime commerce. Every empire found its wealth threatened by small crews of renegades who struck fast, vanished into hidden coves, and knew the currents better than their pursuers. Against this backdrop rose the pirate hubs that would define the era. Nassau on New Providence Island became the most notorious. Once an abandoned English colony devastated by war, Nassau transformed into a lawless republic almost overnight. Its harbor was shallow enough to deter large naval vessels, but deep enough for pirate sloops. The town filled with taverns, makeshift markets, brothels, and the rough laughter of sailors who had nowhere else to go. It was here that pirates elected their own leaders, formed loose alliances, and debated strategy over barrels of rum. Imagine arriving in Nassau around 1716. You would see ships with patched sails and blackened hulls anchored in the sparkling turquoise bay. Dozens of men, sunburned and scarred, would swagger along the shore carrying muskets or pistols tucked into sashes. Vendors sold stolen goods at cut rates. Women of every background, European, African, Creole, and mixed heritage, ran businesses, negotiated deals, and sometimes joined crews themselves. A British official visiting in 1718 claimed that the pirates of Nassau could muster over 2,000 men, enough to challenge the Royal Navy if they ever united. Of course, pirates rarely united for long, but the idea that outcasts could form a semi-functional society alarmed colonial powers. This society wasn't a utopia, but it had principles. Pirate crews practiced a surprising level of democracy, far ahead of the rigid authoritarian structures of European ships. Captains were elected and could be deposed by vote. Plunder was divided according to skill, risk, and merit, ensuring fair compensation. Injury compensation existed. Losing a limb might earn a pirate hundreds of pieces of eight, giving him a chance at a stable life. Decisions were often made collectively. Cruelty, while common, was not random. Many captains who ruled by fear were quickly overthrown. For sailors accustomed to harsh naval discipline and brutal merchant captains, piracy felt like freedom. Within these floating republics, figures emerged who would become legends. Among them was Benjamin Hornigold, a pirate who refused to attack English ships due to his loyalty to Britain. Another was Charles Vane, known for his temper and refusal to accept pardons. And then there was the most famous of all, Edward Teach, known worldwide as Blackbeard. But before we reach Blackbeard's shadow, we must step into the early careers of the men who helped shape Nassau. These individuals did not appear from nowhere. They were shaped by war, poverty, and the harshness of maritime life. Benjamin Hornigold was one of the town's founding fathers. A veteran privateer, he carried the habits of sanctioned raiding into the pirate world. Unlike many pirates, Hornigold insisted on a strange code. His crew would not seize English ships, only those of other nations. This decision both earned him respect and caused tension as the seas became increasingly crowded with English vessels. Hornigold commanded skilled sailors who were fiercely loyal, and his leadership helped Nassau survive its fragile beginnings. Yet his career also highlights the contradictions of pirate identity, loyal to a nation that had abandoned him, yet reliant on outlaw life for survival. Still, Hornigold's most enduring legacy would be his mentorship of a young sailor who would surpass him in infamy. Edward Teach entered history through fragments. We know little about his early life. Some claim he was born in Bristol, others in London. Some suggest he served aboard privateer ships during the Spanish Succession War. What is certain is that by the time he arrived in Nassau, he had already mastered the brutal choreography of naval combat. Teach had an instinct for psychological warfare. He understood that fear was a weapon as powerful as any sword. Tall, imposing, with a thick black beard he tied into braids and lit with slow-burning fuses during battle, he created an image that could unnerve even experienced sailors. Witnesses described him as looking like a demon in the smoke of cannon fire. But beneath this terrifying exterior was a strategic mind. Blackbeard rarely harmed captives unless forced. He preferred surrender. After all, dead sailors could not help sail captured ships. Yet we should not mistake prudence for mercy. Blackbeard was ruthless when cornered and utterly committed to preserving his crew's independence. His career would form a central part of the Golden Age, and his eventual downfall would symbolize the end of the Pirate Republic. But that tale lies ahead in later chapters. While the world remembers figures like Blackbeard, it often forgets the many other pirates whose stories are equally compelling. Take Sam Bellamy, for instance, often called Black Sam. Unlike many pirates, Bellamy was charismatic and idealistic. He is said to have turned to piracy not solely for wealth, but to challenge the cruelty of merchant captains. His crew adored him, and he enforced strict discipline against those who mistreated prisoners. Bellamy's career was short but spectacular, capturing over 50 ships in a single year before dying in a storm off Cape Cod. His ship, the Wider, now lies preserved beneath the waves, a time capsule of pirate life. Another fascinating figure was Howell Davis, a Welshman like Henry Morgan, known for his cunning rather than brute force. Davis preferred deception over violence, sometimes posing as a merchant or even a naval officer to trick his way aboard target ships. He attempted to establish alliances among coastal African rulers and pirate crews in the mid-Atlantic, imagining a network of bases that could resist European domination. His death at the hands of ambushers cut short what might have become one of the most ambitious careers in pirate history. From Davis came one of the most influential pirates of all, Bartholomew Roberts, known as Black Bart. Roberts was reluctant to become a pirate, initially captured against his will. But once he joined, he rose rapidly, becoming one of the most successful pirates ever recorded. Roberts captured over 400 ships, an astonishing number, and implemented strict codes aboard his vessels, forbidding gambling and drunkenness except at designated times. His ships were well kept, his tactics organized, and his leadership firm. Roberts embodied a paradox, a man feared across oceans who despised chaos and insisted on order. His death in battle against the Royal Navy would be one of the final blows to the Golden Age. As we move deeper into this era, it becomes clear that piracy was not merely about plunder. It was a rebellion against systems of oppression. Naval discipline was notoriously brutal. Merchant mariners were often cheated of pay. Enslaved Africans suffered unimaginable atrocities. Pirate ships, by contrast, offered, at least for some, a chance at dignity. People of African descent served as equal crew members on many vessels. Some, like Black Caesar, rose to positions of power. Women, too, found roles despite strict societal norms, though rare. Anne Bonny and Mary Read, two of the most famous female pirates, challenged gender expectations with ferocity that stunned their contemporaries. Their stories will come later, but even now we can see that pirate society was more complicated than the myths portray. The colonial powers, of course, did not see any of this nuance. To them, pirates were criminals undermining trade. Governors pleaded for naval protection. Merchants panicked as insurance rates skyrocketed. Planters feared attacks on their coastal plantations. The British Crown, seeking to restore order, decided to crush Nassau once and for all. In 1718, King George I appointed Woodes Rogers, a former privateer turned administrator, as the new governor of the Bahamas. Rogers was determined, disciplined, and backed by naval force. He sailed into Nassau with a proclamation offering the king's pardon to any pirate who surrendered within a year. It was both a carrot and a stick. Accept mercy or be hunted. The arrival of Rogers was a turning point. Many pirates, weary of constant danger or tempted by amnesty, accepted the pardon. Benjamin Hornigold joined Rogers and even helped hunt down those who refused to submit. Others, like Charles Vane, rejected the offer and fled the harbor under a cloud of cannon smoke. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came when Blackbeard himself considered the pardon. Though he accepted temporary clemency, he would not abandon piracy for long. The crackdown sparked conflict among the pirates. Some sought new bases far from British authority. Others formed loose alliances on the edges of empire. And while Nassau did not die instantly, its role as a pirate republic ended. The freedom that had flourished there was extinguished by economics, politics, and overwhelming military force. Yet for a brief window, a few luminous years, pirates had carved out a world where hierarchy was challenged, fear changed direction, and ordinary sailors tasted autonomy. This golden moment, though fleeting, left a mark on the Caribbean that endures in its legends. As we continue this deep dive, remember that every chapter of Caribbean piracy is shaped by both violence and humanity. These were people caught in the currents of history, sometimes victims of circumstance, sometimes creators of chaos, always navigating between desperation and opportunity. And if you're finding this journey into the true pirate world enlightening or entertaining, feel free to stay connected, support the project, subscribe or like. Whatever helps keep long-form, real history explorations like this alive. There's much more to uncover, and your support helps bring it into the light. The Caribbean, after the fall of Nassau, entered a strange twilight period, a moment when the golden age of piracy was not yet over, but its end had begun to take shape like a storm forming on the horizon. The pirate hunters were increasing in number. Governors were under strict orders to restore order, and the merchants who once quietly tolerated pirates for the cheap stolen goods they supplied were now demanding stability. But even as the noose tightened, the most iconic figures of piracy were only just beginning to etch their names into memory. The seas still held room for legend, and those legends were not eager to surrender their freedom. To understand how the Golden Age reached its peak, one must first step aboard a pirate ship, not the romanticized kind with polished wood and fluttering banners, but the real thing. Picture a sloop or brigantine, not overly large, built for speed rather than comfort. These ships were terrifying not because of their size, but because of their agility. They moved like predators, emerging from behind headlands or reefs with uncanny precision. Their crews were lean, hardened, and united by shared purpose. When they attacked, it was with explosive violence or dramatic intimidation, depending on the captain's method. Life aboard such a ship was far from glamorous. The decks were cramped, soaked in salt water, and often littered with scraps of rigging or tools. Food spoiled quickly in the Caribbean heat. Rats scurried through barrels. Fresh water was scarce and often foul. Hunger and thirst were daily companions. Disease could kill faster than any cutlass. Yet despite all this, many pirates spoke of their ships as havens compared to the merchant vessels they fled. On a pirate ship, every man had a say. On a merchant ship, they had none. This distinction is essential. Piracy was not merely crime, it was a rebellion against the maritime world's rigid cruelty. Captains in the merchant service wielded near-total control, beating crew members at will, withholding wages, or forcing labor under brutal conditions. Naval discipline was even harsher. But on a pirate ship, power flowed from the collective. Captains could be removed by vote. Quartermasters balanced the captain's authority. Loot was divided according to transparent rules. It was dangerous, yes, and often bloody, but also freer than almost any life available to a poor man in the 18th century. Still, freedom alone does not win battles or take prizes. What truly made pirates formidable was their ability to transform themselves into something terrifying at the moment of confrontation. And no pirate mastered psychological warfare better than Edward Teach, Blackbeard. By the time Blackbeard achieved notoriety, he had already absorbed the lessons of Nassau and the chaotic world that birthed him. He knew that violence was costly and risky. He knew that a terrified opponent would surrender far faster than one ready to fight. And he understood that image, theatrics, and the cultivation of myth were weapons as potent as cannon fire. Tales of him lighting slow-burning fuses in his beard, creating a halo of smoke around his face, were not simply eccentric habits. They were calculated psychological tools. Sailors spread the stories, and Blackbeard became larger than life long before he died. His flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, was a captured French vessel he refitted with dozens of cannons. Though not the largest ship in Caribbean waters, it was imposing enough to dwarf the average merchant vessel. With this new power, Blackbeard began shaping the seas to his will. His most famous act was the blockade of Charleston in 1718, where he effectively shut down one of the most prosperous colonial ports by capturing every ship entering or leaving it. Blackbeard's demands were simple. He wanted medical supplies. Not treasure, not hostages, but medicines, because pirate life ravaged the body and sickness often undermined even the strongest crew. The blockade lasted nearly a week. Panic spread through Charleston as ships failed to arrive. Negotiators were sent, terrified of the stories they'd heard. Blackbeard's men waited impatiently, drinking, gambling, and repairing the ship while the city scrambled to meet their demands. When the medicine was finally delivered, Blackbeard released the prisoners unharmed and sailed away, leaving the town shaken but physically intact. This restraint was unusual in an age when violence was the norm. It also illustrates the complexity of Blackbeard's nature. He could be merciful when it suited him and ruthless when threatened. After Charleston, Blackbeard attempted to take advantage of the king's pardon, much as other pirates were doing. He accepted a temporary clemency in North Carolina, but his return to legality was short-lived. Within months, he resumed piracy, manipulating local officials who were either sympathetic or corrupt enough to ignore his activities. Eventually, his enemies grew impatient. The governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, decided to eliminate the threat before North Carolina's weak administration could protect Blackbeard any longer. He sent Lieutenant Robert Maynard with 2 small ships to hunt the pirate down. The encounter that followed would become one of the most dramatic battles in pirate history. Maynard cornered Blackbeard near Ocracoke Island, where the waters were shallow and treacherous. Knowing the British ships were too large to maneuver easily, Blackbeard waited. As Maynard approached, the pirates unleashed a devastating volley of cannon fire, nearly crippling the attackers. But Maynard anticipated this. He had ordered most of his men below deck, leaving the ship seemingly empty. When Blackbeard's crew boarded, expecting an easy victory, Maynard's hidden sailors erupted from below with pistols and cutlasses, catching the pirates off guard. The fight between Maynard and Blackbeard became the stuff of legend. Witnesses claimed they exchanged pistol shots and sword blows at close range. Blackbeard suffered multiple wounds before falling dead. When his body was examined, it reportedly bore 20 knife cuts and 5 gunshot wounds. His head was severed and hung from the bowsprit of Maynard's ship as proof of victory. With his death in 1718, a symbol of pirate power vanished. Many saw it as the moment the Golden Age began to crumble. But the story did not end with Blackbeard. In fact, his death created a vacuum that other captains attempted to fill. Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and the crew members who had once sailed with Blackbeard continued their operations, though none matched his influence. Vane, in particular, resisted the royal pardons and fought bitterly against naval forces. His relationship with his crews was volatile, and his temper often led to reckless decisions. When his men finally lost patience with his leadership, they deposed him, marooning him on a small island. Vane managed to escape, but his luck soon ran out. Captured by English authorities, he was ultimately hanged in Jamaica, a symbol of the empire's tightening grip. Calico Jack Rackham, on the other hand, was less known for his tactical prowess and more for the company he kept. His crew included Anne Bonny and Mary Read, 2 of the most skilled and unusual pirates ever recorded. Their presence on his ship challenged every social expectation of the era. Women were not simply discouraged from sailing, they were considered bad luck. Yet Bonny and Read proved themselves fierce fighters in multiple engagements. Stories claim that when Rackham's crew was cornered by pirate hunters and most of the men fled below deck, Bonny and Read remained above, firing and fighting until they were overwhelmed. Their courage ensured they would be remembered long after Rackham's less impressive legacy faded. Anne Bonny's life before piracy was already exceptional. Born out of wedlock to an Irish lawyer and his servant, she moved to South Carolina as a child, where her father became a plantation owner. Anne grew up defiant, strong-willed, and uninterested in the restrictive roles available to women at the time. She eventually married a poor sailor, left her family, and traveled to Nassau, where she fell in love with Rackham and joined his crew. Unlike Hollywood's characters, the real Bonny was not a caricature of a rebellious woman. She was someone driven by frustration with a society that valued obedience over ability. On a pirate ship, her skills mattered more than her gender. Mary Read's story was even more unusual. Born in England, she spent much of her life disguised as a man. This deception allowed her to work as a sailor and even serve in the military. When she joined Rackham's crew, only Anne Bonny initially knew her secret. The two became close, though not romantically as some romanticized tales suggest. When Reed's identity was revealed to the rest of the crew, it did not diminish her standing. Her fellow pirates respected her bravery in battle. Both women were eventually captured with Rackham in 1720. During their trial, the women famously pleaded the belly, claiming pregnancy, to delay execution. Their sentences were postponed. Rackham was executed immediately, and according to law, Anne visited him before his hanging to tell him she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he wouldn't have been hanged like a dog. Mary Reed died in prison of fever. Anne Bonny's ultimate fate is murky. Some records suggest she returned to her father's plantation and lived quietly, disappearing from pirate history as suddenly as she entered it. As these individual stories unfolded, the broader world continued to reshape itself. Colonies expanded their plantations, filling the Caribbean with sugar mills and slave labor. These plantations demanded security and stability, making piracy unacceptable to growing economic interests. Merchants pressured governments to act. The Royal Navy increased patrols. Governors built forts and improved coastal defenses. Where once pirates could slip in and out of ports with little interference, now they found themselves hunted relentlessly. Another factor that accelerated the decline of piracy was the increasing brutality of punishments. Trials were held publicly. Executions were meant to deter. Bodies were hung in gibbets along harbor entrances as grim reminders. The message was clear: the era of tolerance was over. Piracy would be crushed, not negotiated with. Despite this, many pirates did not surrender easily. Some fled deeper into the Caribbean, seeking untouched islands. Others attempted to settle quietly under false names. A few shifted their operations to West Africa or the Indian Ocean. But the conditions that had made pirate life possible were fading. The seas were no longer a loose frontier. They were becoming corridors of empire, guarded and regulated. The window for pirate republics and outlaw freedom was closing quickly. Yet even as their world collapsed, pirates left a mark on the Caribbean that endures. They disrupted economies, challenged imperial power, and forged communities that reflected an alternate vision of society, one not bound by rank, birth, or national loyalty. And although Hollywood has exaggerated much of their story, it has not entirely invented their spirit. The real pirates were daring, flawed, and human. That humanity is what makes their story worth telling in full. As we continue unfolding these chapters, it's exciting to bring these forgotten truths into focus. If you're enjoying the deep dive into the real lives behind the myths, feel free to stay connected, subscribe, like, or support these long-form history explorations. The more interest we get, the more stories we can uncover together. And there is much more ahead. Stories of the final battles, the collapse of pirate freedom, and the lingering echoes they left behind in Caribbean culture. In the years following the deaths of Blackbeard, Vane, Rackham, and the collapse of Nassau, the Caribbean entered a tense period of transition. The seas did not suddenly empty. Pirate ships still prowled the shipping lanes, and some captains remained defiant, refusing to accept the idea that the Golden Age was ending. But the tides were shifting. Colonial governments were finally coordinating their efforts. Naval patrols became more consistent. Sugar barons, merchants, and planters, those with the most money at stake, were now powerful enough to demand security. The Caribbean was evolving from a chaotic frontier into a series of fortified economic machines. And as the structure of empire tightened, the open spaces where piracy once thrived began shrinking. But the decline was not immediate. There remained pockets of resistance, isolated bursts of pirate defiance that kept colonial governors awake at night. Even as the walls closed in, there was still room for rebellion, cunning, and remarkable adventures. To understand how the Golden Age truly drew its final breaths, one must trace the stories of those final figures who tried to keep the flame of maritime rebellion alive. Among these figures was the formidable Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, whose career stood in stark contrast to the chaos that defined Nassau's pirates. Roberts was not a product of the pirate republic. He emerged from a different lineage, one shaped by personal discipline and ambition rather than the drunken camaraderie of island taverns. Captured unwillingly by pirates in 1719, Roberts surprised everyone by embracing the life he had initially resisted. But unlike many who turned to piracy for temporary escape or chaotic indulgence, Roberts approached it with a sense of order, almost professionalism. Roberts understood, better than most, that if pirates were going to survive the increasingly hostile environment of the Caribbean and Atlantic, they needed to be more than opportunists. They needed strategy and structure. He implemented strict rules aboard his ships. No gambling, no women, no excessive drinking, no theft among crew members. Anyone caught breaking these rules could face punishment by the collective. He refined tactics for chasing merchant ships, disguising his vessels, and using intimidation effectively. While Blackbeard used theatrical terror, Roberts used speed and precision, and it worked. Roberts became the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, capturing more than 400 ships in just a few years. His reach extended far beyond the Caribbean. He raided the coasts of North America, plundered the rich waters of West Africa, and attacked Portuguese and French ships with equal fury. His flags became symbols of rebellion, showing death, skeletons, and sometimes even himself toasting the devil, depending on which ship he commanded at the time. Each had meaning, each served as psychological warfare, reminding targets that Roberts was not merely another stray marauder. He was a master of the seas. Surprisingly, many merchants preferred to surrender rather than engage in a fight with Roberts. It wasn't just fear of death. Roberts had a reputation for being harsh toward naval resistance, but remarkably fair to those who gave up without struggle. He often robbed ships efficiently and released crews unharmed. This earned him a contradictory legacy: ruthless in battle, but pragmatic and humane when practicality demanded it. Some historians argue that he would have made an excellent naval commander had he been born in different circumstances. But instead, he became the last great symbol of pirate power. While Roberts roamed widely, the Caribbean itself remained an unstable mix of fear and opportunity. Governors tried to enforce order, but corruption was rampant. Some officials accepted bribes from pirates, others secretly bought stolen goods or collaborated with outlaw crews. Plantation owners relied heavily on imported labor and supplies. If pirates disrupted trade, the plantations suffered. But when pirates brought in stolen goods at low prices, everyone benefited, except the imperial authorities who were supposed to enforce the law. This tension created a strange environment. On one hand, piracy was officially condemned and increasingly prosecuted. On the other, it continued to be informally supported by people who relied on the shadow economy. In some ports, tavern owners, merchants, and even priests quietly welcomed pirates for the income they brought. Yet these same communities would publicly condemn piracy when naval officers came asking questions. The Caribbean had always been a place where survival often required double lives, and this duality persisted even as pirate numbers dwindled. One of the most overlooked legacies of piracy during this era was its impact on enslaved people and maroon communities, groups of Africans who escaped plantations and formed independent settlements in remote areas. Maroons in Jamaica, Suriname, and parts of Hispaniola often interacted with pirates. Some traded goods or intelligence. Others joined pirate crews outright, finding in them a rough version of freedom vastly superior to plantation life. Those who had been enslaved aboard captured ships were frequently offered a choice: join the pirates as equals or go free. Many chose the former. As pirate numbers fell, these relationships did not vanish. Instead, they evolved. Maroon settlements became increasingly important as safe havens for fugitives and rebels of all kinds. The decline of piracy coincided with growing slave resistance, forming a broader pattern of defiance across the Caribbean. Pirates did not cause this resistance, but they contributed, however subtly, to a culture where the oppressed challenged the very foundations of colonial rule. Another crucial element in the waning years of piracy was the rise of improved naval technology and coordination. During the heyday of the Golden Age, European empires were distracted by wars in Europe and by their own internal rivalries. But by the 1720s and 1730s, these powers began investing more seriously in maritime security. The Royal Navy improved shipbuilding techniques, increased patrols, and stationed more vessels in the Caribbean. France and Spain also began organizing convoys and escorting their merchants. These new patrols were not merely symbolic. They represented a commitment to systematic suppression, something the pirates were ill-equipped to face. Pirate ships, while fast, were often fragile and poorly maintained. Crews were constantly struggling with shortages of gunpowder, food, and medical supplies. Naval ships, on the other hand, had state funding, trained sailors, and the ability to repair and resupply. Piracy had thrived when the seas were neglected. Now they were becoming guarded. But even as the empire sharpened its teeth, defiant pockets of resistance continued. Among the last strongholds of pirate activity were the scattered islands and remote coasts that large naval ships struggled to patrol. Inlets in modern-day Belize, Honduras, and parts of Cuba served as hideouts. Some pirates blended into the populations of these regions, marrying locals, taking up fishing or small-scale trading, and living out their days quietly. Others fled entirely from the hemisphere, heading for the Indian Ocean or Madagascar. But the age of large-scale Caribbean piracy was ending. Bartholomew Roberts' death in 1722 is often seen as the symbolic closing of the Golden Age. Chased by the Royal Navy off the coast of West Africa, Roberts refused to surrender even when heavily outgunned. A cannon volley struck him, killing him instantly. His crew, following his wishes, dropped his body into the sea rather than allow it to be captured. Within hours, his fleet was defeated. Many were hanged. The greatest remaining pirate threat was gone, and with it, the last locomotive force of widespread maritime rebellion. Yet even as pirate ships disappeared, the idea of piracy took on a new life. In taverns and ports across the Caribbean, sailors told stories, some true, many wildly exaggerated. These stories spread north to the colonies, then across the Atlantic to Europe. Books like A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, sensationalized the lives of pirates, mixing fact and fiction freely. The book introduced many readers to the names of Blackbeard, Bonny, Reed, and Roberts, shaping their legacy for centuries. This was the beginning of the pirate myth, the transformation of real people into symbols of rebellion, adventure, and danger. This myth-making process mattered. As piracy declined in real life, it flourished in the imagination. Children played at being pirates. Writers romanticized them. Political thinkers even used pirate democracy as a metaphor for challenging monarchies. The real world had stamped out the outlaw fleets, but the idea of freedom on the open sea lived on. Even in the Caribbean itself, pirate memory lingered. Some islands preserved pirate legends in local folklore. Hidden treasure stories became part of community identities, fueling rumors of buried gold beneath beaches and jungles. Scholars today rarely find evidence for these tales, but their persistence reflects the cultural impact pirates had. They had terrified and disrupted, yes, but they had also inspired wonder. The end of piracy also transformed colonial policy. Once the seas were more secure, empires intensified their exploitation of the Caribbean. Plantation economies expanded rapidly. More enslaved Africans were brought into the region, forming the devastating heart of Caribbean wealth. Ports grew busier. Trade routes grew wealthier. The same forces that ended piracy made the Caribbean more profitable for Europe and more oppressive for those forced to labor there. This contradiction sits at the heart of the region's history. Pirates, despite their violence, represented a kind of freedom for many who were trapped by rigid colonial hierarchies. Their ships, though dangerous, operated on rules that valued equality among crew members. In contrast, the colonial world that replaced piracy was built on some of the most brutal labor systems in human history. The civilization that crushed the pirates simultaneously entrenched the plantation system that would shape the Caribbean for generations. As we move through these chapters, this tension becomes increasingly important. The struggle between freedom and domination, rebellion and order, myth and reality. The pirates of the Caribbean did not disappear quietly, nor were they merely simple criminals. They were products of their time, rebels shaped by war, oppression, poverty, and opportunity. And although their era is often superficialized by movies and costumes, the real stories are richer, darker, and far more meaningful. If you've been enjoying this exploration of the truth behind the pirate myths, thank you for sticking with it. Bringing these long-form stories to life takes time, care, and passion, and your interest encourages me to keep going. If you'd like to follow more documentary-style deep dives like this, feel free to subscribe, like, or support in any way you enjoy. It helps keep this journey alive as we move closer to the dramatic final collapse of Caribbean piracy. By the time the 1730s arrived, the Caribbean had changed so thoroughly that someone who lived through the days of Nassau's pirate republic might have struggled to recognize it. The pirate flags that once drifted across the horizon were becoming rare sightings, the sort of thing sailors spoke of in half-whispered memories rather than current fears. Ports that once brimmed with lawless energy now echoed with the disciplined steps of soldiers and the steady rhythm of regulated commerce. The transition was not merely political, it was cultural, economic, and psychological. The Caribbean was being reshaped into something far safer for empires and far more suffocating for anyone who once reveled in rebellion. But before the transformation could be fully secured, a series of events unfolded that demonstrated how fragile order could be when built upon shaky foundations. Piracy was waning, yes, but it was not dead. In small coves, hidden rivers, and remote islands, the old spirit persisted. A handful of captains still tried to carve out their fortunes, their stories weaving into the final tapestry of the Golden Age's end. Their exploits, though less grand than those of Blackbeard or Roberts, reveal the stubborn resilience of men unwilling to yield to empire. Among the lesser-known but fascinating figures of this twilight period was Edward Lowe, one of the most violent pirates ever to sail. Lowe was not a romantic hero. He had none of the flamboyant charisma of Rackham or the intimidating majesty of Blackbeard. Instead, he was fueled by rage, bitterness, and cruelty. Born into poverty in London, Lowe grew up in an environment where survival required hardness. He went to sea as many desperate men did, turning to piracy not out of adventure, but out of fury at the world that had offered him little. Lowe's brutality became legendary even among pirates, who generally preferred intimidation over needless bloodshed. He tortured prisoners, mutilated captives, and spread terror for terror's sake. Some crews abandoned him, unwilling to be associated with such reckless rage. Yet his story is significant because it shows a darker side to piracy that Hollywood seldom touches. The side where violence becomes the only language a man believes the world understands. Lowe disappeared mysteriously after 1724, likely killed by mutineers or executed in a foreign port. His end was uncelebrated, fitting for a life steeped in chaos without charisma. Another figure of the era was George Lowther, a man who began as an officer on a merchant ship and turned pirate after a mutiny sparked by the cruel behavior of the captain. Lowther's crew admired him far more than Lowe's men admired their vicious leader. Lowther ruled not with terror, but with fairness. He understood that loyalty was earned, not imposed. His story reflects how piracy could rise from a conflict between justice and injustice. When mutinies occurred on merchant ships, they were often driven not by greed, but by the unbearable conditions sailors endured. Flogging, starvation, withholding pay, and physical abuse were commonplace. Lowther's transformation from officer to pirate captain embodies the idea that many pirates saw themselves as rebelling against tyranny rather than merely embracing criminality. Lowther's fate was grim but dramatic. His ship crashed on land after a violent storm. The crew scattered, some were captured, others fled. Lowther himself was cornered by soldiers on the coast and chose to take his own life rather than face public hanging. His death was quiet, overshadowed by the greater legends of his era, but he represents the many forgotten figures whose experiences shaped the final chapters of Caribbean piracy. One of his companions was an extraordinary man named John Calico Jack, Rackham's former crewmate, though not the famous Calico Jack himself. Another Jack by the name of John Gow, who attempted to establish a pirate base in the northern Atlantic after Caribbean opportunities dwindled. Gow's story is a reminder that piracy was not confined to the tropics. When Caribbean waters became too dangerous, some outlaws headed north to the Orkney Islands or Iceland. But piracy struggled to thrive in these colder, less forgiving regions, and when Gow attempted to maintain a pirate colony on land, his plans collapsed. He was captured, tried, and executed in London, where his death was witnessed by curious crowds fascinated by the idea of seeing a real pirate. These stories illustrate an important trend. As naval pressure increased, the remaining pirates were forced into riskier and more desperate ventures. Gone were the days when a pirate crew could confidently blockade a major port or capture dozens of ships in a month. Now, survival required constant movement, careful hiding, and luck, lots of luck. Many turned to petty theft, raiding small fishing villages or stealing from coastal plantations. Others attempted to relocate to new seas, such as the Indian Ocean, where the remnants of the old pirate havens near Madagascar still offered potential refuge. But even those havens were fading. The settlement at Isle Sainte-Marie off Madagascar, once home to hundreds of pirates, dwindled as disease, conflict, and European intervention eroded its stability. By the 1730s, the golden era of Madagascar piracy had ended, just as it had in the Caribbean. The global crackdown was reaching its final phase. Yet the legacy of the pirate lifestyle persisted in the memories of sailors who had witnessed its brief flash of freedom. These sailors shared stories in waterfront taverns from Kingston to Boston, describing ships where captains could be voted out, where loot was shared equally, where no man bowed to another simply because of birth or rank. These tales lingered in the minds of listeners, especially those who worked under harsh conditions. The idea of a shipboard democracy, a community where every man's voice mattered, became part of the pirate mythos, one that still echoes through modern imagination. But the realities of empire were overpowering. As colonial plantations expanded, they created strong economic incentives to eliminate disruptions to trade. The sugar economy alone was producing staggering wealth. A single Caribbean plantation might generate tens of thousands of pounds in annual profit, a fortune by 18th century standards. The European elite had no intention of allowing pirates, especially small bands of desperate holdouts, to threaten these profits. Naval investments increased. Fortifications were reinforced. Laws became harsher. Even the colonial courts, which had once been easily bribed, grew stricter under pressure from their superiors. This tightening of legal and military control coincided with another shift, the growing presence of European settlers. In earlier decades, many islands had small populations, leaving room for pirate enclaves to flourish. Now, settlement expanded, Plantations grew, and trade networks connected every port with a steady stream of ships. The edges of empire had receded. There were fewer wild places left for pirates to hide. Every harbor now had customs officers, soldiers, and merchants who valued stability. Pirates could no longer blend into the crowds or bribe officials as easily. Still, small groups clung to rebellion. One of the most interesting remnants of the pirate spirit appeared in maroon communities, especially in Jamaica and Suriname. These communities, formed by Africans who escaped from plantations, maintained a fierce independence. Like pirates, they resisted European rule. Their relationships with remaining pirate groups were sometimes cooperative, sometimes combative, but always intriguing. Maroons and pirates shared an understanding of what it meant to resist the crushing force of empire. In Jamaica, the British government fought brutal wars against maroon settlements, yet failed to destroy them. Some Maroons even served as guides for British forces hunting down the last Caribbean pirates, turning the complicated politics of resistance into a shifting web of alliances. Freedom in the Caribbean was not a single story, but a mosaic of interconnected struggles. This mosaic also included the indigenous peoples of the region, whose lives were forever altered by colonization long before the pirates arrived. By the 18th century, many indigenous communities had been decimated by disease, violence, and forced relocation. Yet in certain remote regions, parts of the Yucatan, the Mosquito Coast, and smaller islands, indigenous groups still maintained autonomy. Pirates sometimes formed alliances with these groups, trading goods or using their lands as hiding spots. These relationships rarely lasted, but they represent another piece of the complex social fabric that piracy inhabited. As European empires cemented their control, the Caribbean's cultural landscape changed. New towns grew, built with the profits of plantation slavery. Ports like Bridgetown, Haiti's Cap Francaise, Kingston, and Havana expanded rapidly. The wealth generated from sugar, coffee, and rum flowed back to Europe, funding palaces, universities, and luxurious lifestyles. Meanwhile, the people whose labor created that wealth, enslaved Africans, lived under horrific conditions. Their suffering forms the brutal counterpart to the Caribbean's economic success. It is in this contrast, the fleeting freedom of pirates versus the entrenched oppression of plantation society, that one finds the deeper meaning of the Golden Age. Piracy was a disruption of a system built on inequality. It was not a noble rebellion in the modern sense. Pirates were not revolutionaries seeking to liberate the enslaved or dismantle empire, but their existence challenged the notion that the seas belonged solely to great powers. Their ships operated like egalitarian micro-societies in a world otherwise ruled by hierarchy. This contrast helps explain why pirate stories continue to captivate. People are drawn to the idea of freedom found at the edges of oppressive systems, even if that freedom was messy, violent, and short-lived. Pirates lived and died by their own rules. And as the Caribbean shifted into a new era, many sailors, workers, and enslaved people would look back on that brief window as a symbol of the possibility, however imperfect, of resisting domination. By the end of the 1730s, the last major pirate cruise in the Caribbean had been captured, killed, or driven off. Public executions grew rare simply because there were fewer pirates left to hang. Naval officers reported quieter seas. Merchants breathed easier. Ports expanded. Plantation owners counted their profits, and Europe congratulated itself on restoring order. But order in the Caribbean never stayed peaceful for long. Within decades, massive slave uprisings, including the Haitian Revolution, would shake the region to its core. Privateering would rise again during future wars. Smuggling would flourish, and the stories of the Golden Age pirates would become part of the region's cultural DNA. As we prepare to move into the final phases of this long story, thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you're enjoying these deep documentary-style narratives, Feel free to stick around, subscribe, like, or support. It really helps keep these detailed explorations going. There's much more to uncover as we head toward the last great clashes and the lasting legacy of the Caribbean's real pirates. By the middle of the 18th century, the Caribbean had entered a new and uneasy equilibrium. The seas were quieter, the great pirate captains long dead, and the governors across the islands began to boast that order had finally returned. Yet beneath the surface, the echoes of the pirate age still lingered. Ship captains remained wary of the open ocean, coastal settlements still braced for unexpected raiders, and sailors continued to pass down tales of men who had lived by no law but the wind. The Golden Age was dying, but its ghost remained alive in the collective memory of the Caribbean. To understand the aftershocks of piracy, one must examine not only the final outbursts of outlaw activity, but also the deeper cultural, economic, and political changes that followed the decline. The disappearance of pirates created a vacuum that empires were eager to fill. They strengthened their naval presence, expanded their colonial bureaucracies, and tightened control over trade. But even as governments tried to create a world defined by rigid authority, the legacy of pirate defiance inspired new forms of resistance. In these decades after the Golden Age, the Caribbean was reshaped by forces that had always been present, but were now ascending to dominance. The plantation economy tightened its grip on the islands, fueled by the transatlantic slave trade. Ports grew, commerce flourished, and European wealth soared. This transition would define the Caribbean for centuries, but it also illuminated the stark difference between the world pirates once inhabited and the world that replaced them. What made piracy unique was its contrast to the structured brutality of the plantation system. Pirates lived chaotically and dangerously, yes, but they lived under a collective agreement that recognized individual worth. Plantation society, in contrast, was a rigid hierarchy enforced by violence. The more plantations expanded, the more enslaved Africans were brought across the ocean in horrifying numbers. The Caribbean was becoming the center of one of the most profitable and most brutal economic systems in human history. On many islands, the enslaved population outnumbered free whites by 10 or 20 to 1. This imbalance sowed fear into colonial governments and hinted at future rebellions that would shake the world. In the early years following the fall of the major pirate fleets, remnants of pirate activity still appeared. Small gangs of seaborne thieves continued to harass lightly defended ships. These were not the grand corsairs of old, but desperate men clinging to a dying trade. Their attacks seldom made headlines and were mostly confined to remote waters. But they served as reminders that piracy never fully disappeared. It simply adapted and diminished. One of the more curious transformations during this period was the resurgence of privateering during times of war. Whenever European nations clashed, which they did often, privateering became legal once more, blurring the lines between pirate and patriot. A man who would be hanged in peacetime could be celebrated in wartime for capturing enemy ships. The same sailors who once flew black flags now hoisted national colors and received government-sanctioned commissions. For instance, during the War of Jenkins' Ear in the 1740s and the later 7 Years' War, both Britain and Spain relied heavily on privateers. These legal corsairs raided enemy shipping, disrupted colonial supply lines, and occasionally behaved with the same recklessness as the pirates they had replaced. Colonial officials encouraged privateering because it allowed them to weaken enemy powers without risking their own naval fleets. The irony was clear. Governments that had spent decades hanging pirates now handed out letters of marque to men with nearly identical intentions. But privateering, unlike piracy, always came with limitations. A privateer served a nation's interests, not his own autonomy. His profits were split with investors, and his actions were bound by military strategy. Whenever peace returned, privateers lost their legitimacy and were expected to retire quietly. Many of them struggled to adapt. Some slipped into smuggling. Others returned to merchant work reluctantly. A few, carried by old habits, fell back into illegal raiding and were hunted as pirates once more. Smuggling became a major force in the Caribbean as piracy faded. With the empires imposing strict trade regulations, most famously Britain's Navigation Acts, colonists often found legal commerce too restrictive and too costly. Smugglers filled the gap, transporting goods between islands, trading with rival empires, and profiting from markets officially forbidden. These smugglers were not pirates in the traditional sense. They operated more like covert businessmen. But they shared one philosophical trait with the pirates. They believed the oceans did not belong to any empire. Their ships darted through the night, using knowledge of reefs, currents, and hidden inlets to evade customs patrols. Some former pirates joined these smuggling networks. Unlike pirate raids, smuggling required restraint, secrecy, and regular trade relations. For men who had once roared across the seas with cannons blazing, adjusting to this quieter life was difficult. But for those who survived long enough to grow weary of danger, smuggling offered a middle ground between rebellion and survival. Even as maritime crime shifted forms, colonial societies continued to feel the deep imprint left by the pirate age. One of the most lasting effects was the idea of collective governance that pirates had practiced. Their democratic style of ship management, imperfect but radical for its time, influenced later political thinking. Sailors and working-class people who heard tales of pirate governance sometimes drew comparisons with the oppressive structures they lived under. On a pirate ship, a man could vote. On land, most men could not. This comparison grew especially potent as revolutionary ideas spread later in the 18th century. Some historians argue that pirate codes, though tied to criminal enterprise, prefigured certain principles that would later emerge in the American and Haitian revolutions. Pirates were not political revolutionaries, but the stories of their egalitarian ships circulated widely enough that they seeped into the social imagination. In the Caribbean itself, resistance movements took other forms. The Maroon communities, settlements of escaped enslaved Africans, continued to challenge European domination. In Jamaica, Maroons fought two major wars against the British, and even after treaties were signed, tensions remained. Maroons operated with guerrilla tactics that resembled the independence of pirate crews, self-governed, armed, and deeply knowledgeable of the terrain. Their settlements were living reminders that opposition to empire did not die with the pirates. Meanwhile, the plantation system created the conditions for even larger uprisings. The enslaved populations of Haiti, Jamaica, Antigua, and other islands endured such extreme brutality that rebellion was inevitable. Although the Golden Age pirates had long vanished by the time the Haitian Revolution ignited in 1791, the spirit of defiance they embodied had already woven itself into Caribbean culture. Haitian revolutionaries, many of whom had maritime backgrounds or new seafarers, sometimes referred to themselves metaphorically as corsairs of liberty. The idea of overthrowing oppressive systems had deep roots. Another lingering connection between piracy and later resistance movements lies in religion and folklore. In parts of the Caribbean, pirates became figures of legend in the same way saints, spirits, or ancestral heroes did. Island cultures merged pirate stories with African spiritual beliefs, indigenous mythologies, and European tales. This blending produced ballads, superstitions, and ghost stories that continue to echo in the region today. A fisherman might avoid a certain cove, claiming a pirate's spirit still guarded buried treasure. Children might hear stories about cursed coins or phantom ships that appear in storms. Though these tales are not historical in a strict sense, they are part of the cultural residue that piracy left behind. Of course, no discussion of the post-pirate Caribbean can ignore the rise of organized naval patrols. Britain, having emerged as a dominant naval power, stationed ships throughout the Caribbean to enforce trade regulations, deter smuggling, and protect merchant vessels. Spanish and French fleets also patrolled their colonial waters more aggressively. For sailors, encountering a naval frigate became far more common than encountering a pirate sloop. These patrols created a sense of safety for merchants, but they also intensified tensions with colonists who resented the strict enforcement of trade laws. Naval officers sometimes abused their authority. These conflicts contributed to later colonial rebellions, including the American Revolution. It is ironic that the suppression of pirates, who symbolized defiance of empire, helped pave the way for future revolutions against imperial rule. As the decades rolled on, the Caribbean solidified into a region defined by plantation wealth, naval control, and ethnic diversity, shaped by forced migration. Pirates became something that existed in memory, not in reality. But their memory was powerful enough to outlast the political structure that crushed them. Even travelers in the 19th century reported how locals still spoke of Blackbeard and Roberts as though they were recent threats. Fishermen swore they could still see ghostly ships in moonlit waters. Merchants warned crews to avoid certain reefs where pirate spirits were rumored to lure ships to wreckage. This folklore kept the legacy alive, even as modern systems replaced the old world entirely. By the time the century turned, the Caribbean belonged firmly to empire and plantation economics, but the memory of pirates cast a shadow across both the sea and the imagination. These outlaw sailors had appeared suddenly, lived fiercely, and died violently. Yet somehow their presence lingered. And this is part of why their story remains so appealing. It exists at the crossroads of rebellion and survival, brutality and freedom, chaos and order. As we explore the final chapters of the Golden Age, it's incredible to watch how many layers of Caribbean history trace their roots back to these unpredictable outlaws. If you're still enjoying this deep dive into the truth behind the myth, feel free to stick around, subscribe, like, or just follow along. It helps keep long-form storytelling like this alive as we push forward into the last great episodes of pirate history. As the 18th century advanced, and the last of the great pirate captains slipped into legend, the Caribbean entered a complicated period where the memory of the outlaw seas clashed with the growing machinery of empire. Though the Golden Age was effectively over, its shadows stretched across decades, influencing culture, policy, and even the psychology of the region. The seas were no longer ruled by men who voted on their captains at sea, but governed instead by the rigid laws of colonial powers whose interests were rooted in profit rather than freedom. Yet the end of piracy did not erase its mark. Instead, it reshaped the Caribbean in ways subtle and profound. The symbolism of pirates, the image of men living outside the reach of kings, lingered long after the last black flags were torn down. Sailors who had once shared grog in Nassau's taverns were now scattered throughout the Atlantic world, many blending into coastal communities where their stories became part of local law. Some became fishermen, others took up work on merchant ships, and a few, in strange twists of fate, even became pilot navigators employed by the same colonial governments they had once defied. But none of them truly forgot the sense of independence that piracy had offered. It was a freedom impossible to find on merchant decks, where hierarchy ruled, or on plantations, where cruelty was everyday life. These former pirates carried with them a legacy of autonomy that unsettled colonial authorities. Governors worried that too many men remembered a world where laws were optional and lives were governed by votes. They sought to bury that memory under new regulations, harsher punishments, and increased surveillance. But memories are harder to suppress than ships. In fact, one of the most fascinating transitions of this era was the shift of rebellion from the seas to the land. The decline of piracy coincided with the strengthening of maroon societies, the rise of organized slave resistance, and the development of clandestine trade networks. It was almost as if the rebellious spirit of the Caribbean had simply changed form rather than disappeared. In the thick forests and mountains of Jamaica, the Maroons stood as one of the Caribbean's greatest symbols of freedom. They were communities of people who had escaped from plantations and built independent societies in the rugged interior. During the height of the pirate era, Maroons sometimes interacted with pirates, trading goods, sharing information, or simply coexisting as parallel states beyond imperial control. After piracy faded, the Maroons continued their defiance. Their conflicts with the British culminated in two major wars, both brutal and both highlighting the fragility of imperial dominance. The Maroons' use of guerrilla warfare often resembled tactics used by pirates. Hit unpredictably, use terrain advantage, vanish before reinforcements arrive. This parallel evolution is important. Piracy may have ended as a maritime phenomenon, but the underlying forces that had sparked it, oppression, inequality, rigid hierarchies, were still present on land. Plantation life in the Caribbean was becoming increasingly harsh, driven by the insatiable demand for sugar in Europe. The more profitable plantations became, the worse conditions grew for enslaved Africans. The chasm between the elite and the oppressed widened. In this sense, the end of piracy coincided with the intensification of colonial brutality. Pirates had been a threat to maritime commerce, but the real long-term threat to European control came from the enslaved population. Plantations lacked the egalitarian codes of pirate ships. There were no votes, no shared rewards, no freedom. Instead, there was forced labor, dehumanization, and violence. As plantations grew, so did resistance, slow, quiet at first, then increasingly bold. One of the most dramatic shifts during this period was the explosion of the sugar economy. Islands like Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, and Saint-Domingue, modern Haiti, transformed into engines of agriculture. Sugar mills churned day and night. Coffles of enslaved Africans marched from ports to plantations. The wealth produced was staggering. European elites grew richer than ever, and cities like London, Bristol, Nantes, and Amsterdam saw fortunes built on Caribbean commodities. Yet beneath this prosperity lay suffering so intense that many enslaved people chose death over continued servitude. It is here that the memory of piracy becomes especially intriguing. Some enslaved people admired pirates not because pirates sought to free them, most did not, but because pirates represented resistance to the very powers that enslaved them. Stories circulated of pirates who freed enslaved captives from ships, who treated them as equals on board, who gave them weapons instead of chains. Though such events were not universal, they were common enough that the pirate became a symbol of possibility. The idea of a life not ruled by overseers or masters took root, even if only in whispers. These whispers grew into something far greater in Saint-Domingue, where enslaved Africans eventually launched the Haitian Revolution, the only successful slave uprising in world history. Though the revolution began decades after the golden age of piracy had ended, its ideological winds carried faint traces of pirate rebellion. The idea that authority could be overturned, that oppressive systems could be challenged, that the powerful could be defeated, all these concepts had been dramatized at sea long before they were realized on land. Meanwhile, the maritime world continued to evolve. Privateering resurfaced in every new war, blurring legal and illegal violence. European powers, hungry for leverage, again issued letters of marque to sailors willing to raid enemy ships. These state-sanctioned sea raiders often behaved with the same ruthlessness as pirates, but now under the banner of nationalism. Colonial newspapers celebrated privateering heroes who, a generation earlier, might have been hanged. It was an era that revealed the hypocrisy of empire. Piracy was unacceptable unless it profited the empire. Some privateers eventually crossed back into outright piracy when wars ended and opportunities disappeared. The boundaries between these roles remained fluid. Colonial governors sometimes looked the other way when privateers continued raiding illegally, especially if they targeted rival empires. But after a few decades, naval patrols reasserted their dominance, suppressing both piracy and unauthorized privateering alike. Yet even as the seas became more regulated, the old pirate routes, hideouts, and legends persisted. Small islands like the dry Tortugas, the Cays off Belize, and the scattered keys near Cuba retained an atmosphere of mystery. Local fishermen claimed to find old coins washed ashore. Divers reported shipwrecks whose origins were unknown. Treasure hunters traveled from Europe and America, hoping to uncover chests of gold hidden by figures like Blackbeard or Henry Morgan. Most searches turned up nothing more than rusted nails or broken pottery, but the allure of hidden wealth endured. This obsession with pirate treasure shows how deeply pirate mythology became embedded in Caribbean culture. Many islands have their own stories of buried gold, cursed relics, or phantom ships. In some places, these legends blended with African spiritual systems and indigenous beliefs. A pirate's ghost became not merely a haunting figure, but a cultural symbol, sometimes a warning, sometimes a protector, sometimes a bridge between past and present. The mythology reshaped the Caribbean imagination, and in doing so, ensured that pirates would never fully vanish. Another important after-effect of piracy's decline was the shift in maritime labor. With naval patrols increasing, merchant vessels needed more disciplined crews. Yet life aboard these vessels remained deeply unpleasant, marked by low pay, harsh treatment, and long voyages. Sailors continued to resist authority, staging mutinies or deserting whenever possible. And though piracy no longer offered a widespread alternative, smuggling networks provided another outlet for maritime rebellion. Smuggling was, in many cases, safer and more profitable than piracy. While pirates risked hanging if caught, smugglers often faced fines or temporary imprisonment. Their work required stealth and intelligence rather than brute force. Former pirates often found smuggling appealing, especially if they wanted to stay on the edges of empire without inviting too much attention. The Caribbean's geography, its countless coves, reefs, channels, and mangrove forests, made it perfect for illicit trade. Even today, those same waterways remain difficult to patrol. By the late 18th century, colonial governments were confident that piracy was finished. They believed they had replaced chaos with order, rebellion with structure, freedom with control. They had no idea that within a few decades, the Caribbean would erupt into the most transformative revolution the region had ever seen. The Haitian Revolution would obliterate French control of Saint-Domingue, end plantation slavery, and fundamentally reshape the world. That revolution was not inspired by pirates, but the idea that authority could be defied had long been part of Caribbean history, carried in the tales of those who once lived by the sea. And so, even as the golden age of piracy faded, its spirit lived on, not as a direct legacy, but as a cultural undercurrent that influenced how people understood resistance. Pirates had shown that empires could be defied. Maroons showed that fugitives could build communities that survived imperial assault. Enslaved Africans showed that even the mightiest colonial powers could be overthrown. The Caribbean, once the playground of pirate liberty, became the birthplace of revolutionary freedom. Through all of this, the stories of the Golden Age remained alive. Books, ballads, and later plays and early novels kept the legends circulating. Sailors swapped stories in taverns from Havana to New York, adding embellishments with every telling. And each generation added its own interpretations, until the real men of the Golden Age faded into the fog of folklore. Even today, when people imagine pirates, they see not the malnourished, exhausted, sunburned sailors of the 18th century, but the mythic figures shaped by those centuries of storytelling. And part of what makes their stories so captivating is that mixture of truth and imagination. The real pirates were flawed, dangerous, desperate, and often brutal. Yet they lived in a way most people of their time could not. Free from rigid hierarchy, free from national loyalty, free, at least temporarily, from the economic chains that bound the rest of society. As you've followed these chapters, I hope you've sensed not only the drama of pirate life, but the deeper history beneath it. And if you're still enjoying this long-form deep dive into the real Caribbean pirates and want more documentary-style explorations like this, feel free to stay connected, subscribe, like, or support these stories. It truly helps bring forgotten history back into the light. By the time the last embers of the golden age of piracy cooled, and the Caribbean settled into a new rhythm of empire, trade, and plantation rule, the story of the pirates themselves became something different from the men who had once walked the docks of Nassau or Tortuga. The individuals had died or disappeared, but their legends had begun to live independently, shifting, expanding, and in many cases, transforming into something more exaggerated, mysterious, and symbolic than the truth ever had been. This transformation from lived reality to cultural mythology is one of the most fascinating periods in the entire saga of Caribbean piracy, because it reveals not just what pirates did, but what the world wanted them to represent. As the 18th century drew to a close, people across Europe and the Americas were hungry for stories of adventure, danger, and rebellion. The world was changing. Revolutions erupted, empires clashed, and ordinary people questioned old systems of power. Amid this upheaval, tales of pirates, men who defied kings, created their own rules, and lived by their own codes, captured imaginations like wildfire. It did not matter that most pirates died young or lived harsh, miserable lives. What mattered was the symbol they became. The earliest historians and writers who documented pirate life played a massive role in shaping this new myth. One of the most influential books of the era was a general history of the pirates, published in 1724 under the pseudonym Captain Charles Johnson. Scholars still debate who Johnson really was. Some believe it was Daniel Defoe, the author of Robinson Crusoe. Whoever the true author, the book immortalized figures like Blackbeard, Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Bartholomew Roberts, and Calico Jack. But Johnson's work mixed fact with fiction freely, shaping narratives that sometimes bore only partial resemblance to reality. For example, Johnson portrayed Blackbeard as a monstrous figure who lived in constant violence, when in truth the pirate preferred psychological warfare and relatively bloodless capture methods. Similarly, the stories of Anne Bonny and Mary Read were embellished dramatically, transforming them into near-mythical warrior women rather than the complex, nuanced individuals they were. The book cemented stereotypes: the pirate captain with a flamboyant hat, the ship bristling with cannons and flags, the dramatic last-stand battles, and buried treasure maps. These were embellishments, not accurate accounts, but they appealed to the public's imagination. Soon, pirate stories were no longer reports of real events. They were entertainment. This transition from reality to mythology affected how even sailors spoke about their past. Men who had once served on merchant ships or privateers began adding flourishes to their tales. The dull parts, the weeks of hunger, the boredom of drifting, the stink of rotting barrels fell away. What remained were the dramatic moments: the chase, the fight, the capture, the daring escape. A sailor who had once served under a minor pirate might suddenly find himself telling stories as if he had shared a deck with Blackbeard or faced the cannons of the Royal Navy in heroic combat. Meanwhile, the Caribbean itself became a canvas where myths were painted onto real places. Small inlets or abandoned forts became rumored treasure sites. Unmarked graves on remote islands were said to hold the bones of pirates who died defending their hidden riches. Every unexplained shipwreck became a candidate for pirate gold. Some plantation owners even encouraged slave laborers to believe in pirate curses as a way to discourage them from running off into the forests or searching for hidden wealth. The legacy of piracy seeped into regional folklore in ways that blended truth, fear, and fascination. The most intriguing part of this growing mythology is how different communities in the Caribbean interpreted it. For the European colonists, pirates represented a dangerous but romanticized element of the past, an era already fading, worthy of embellished retelling but not serious respect. For the enslaved Africans and their descendants, pirate stories held a different resonance. Pirates, in many accounts, were seen as symbols of defiance against European power. In some oral traditions, pirates were imagined as spirits who protected the oppressed or punished the cruel. In others, they became cautionary tales about greed or betrayal. There were even cases where maroon communities adopted pirate stories into their cultural memory, translating them into African spiritual frameworks. In some versions, pirates became ancestors wandering the sea between worlds, neither living nor dead. The stories served as metaphors for survival, rebellion, and resistance. While these narratives were rarely documented by European writers, traces of them survive in oral histories, proverbs, and folklore in Jamaica, Haiti, Dominica, and parts of Central America. Meanwhile, in Europe and North America, stories of pirates grew increasingly sanitized. By the 19th century, Romantic literature had transformed pirates from gritty seafarers into swashbuckling adventurers. The darker aspects of piracy, torture, disease, starvation, the killing of innocents, were softened or ignored. Instead, pirates became charming rogues, rebellious heroes, or tragic figures battling cruel governments. This literary evolution culminated in works like Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island, published in 1883, which introduced the world to characters like Long John Silver. Stevenson's novel solidified the idea of buried treasure, tropical islands hiding secrets, and pirates speaking in accents that modern audiences would later associate with film versions rather than history. By the time cinema arrived in the 20th century, the pirate myth had been polished into something almost unrecognizable from the truth. Films portrayed pirates as daring enthusiasts of freedom, swaggering across decks with witty charm. The violence, hardship, and systemic injustice of the real Caribbean were erased in favor of adventure and comedy. The cruel plantation societies that had dominated the Caribbean during the time of real pirates were rarely portrayed in film or books. It was more comfortable to imagine pirates as rebels against tyranny than to confront the brutality of the colonial world itself. Yet beneath this global mythologizing, the real Caribbean continued to evolve in ways that echoed the pirate legacy. Smugglers, rebels, fishermen, and sailors in the islands carried forward many pirate traditions without necessarily linking themselves to the old outlaw culture. Seamanship, guerrilla tactics, knowledge of hidden waterways, and independent trade networks all persisted long after the age of golden pirate banners. In some small communities, certain families even claimed descent from pirates, whether true or not mattered less than the cultural pride it brought. At the same time, historians in the Caribbean began reclaiming the true stories of pirates as part of their regional identity. They emphasized how pirates had challenged European control, disrupted the slave economy, and carved out spaces of relative equality aboard their ships, no matter how temporary or limited. While the Caribbean did not celebrate pirates in the way Hollywood did, the region recognized them as part of its complex past. In ports like Kingston, Nassau, and Bridgetown, archaeological digs uncovered remains of pirate havens, ships, and artifacts that provided a clearer picture of their lives. Buttons, pistol fragments, belt buckles, coins, and even medical tools revealed daily realities of pirate crews beyond the myth. The emerging field of pirate archaeology showed that these men led harsh, often miserable lives marked by constant struggle. But it also revealed the collective systems that had governed pirate ships: the shared plunder, the compensation for injuries, the elections, and the written codes. These discoveries led to a deeper understanding of how pirate life contrasted with the social systems of its time. Historians began arguing that pirates created early forms of egalitarian maritime societies as reactions against extreme inequality. Their codes of conduct, while steeped in violence, offered versions of fairness often missing in mainstream society. Some scholars even drew connections between pirate practices and later democratic movements, though such connections are symbolic rather than direct. But if pirates once symbolized rebellion at sea, the Caribbean's later revolutions symbolized rebellion on land. And in many ways, the Haitian Revolution was the last thunderclap of the same storm that had produced piracy. Though led by enslaved Africans and infused with its own ideological roots, the revolution echoed the pirate claim that no king or empire had the right to rule by force. It was not piracy by another name, but both movements challenged European domination in ways that ultimately reshaped global history. By the 19th century, the Caribbean's landscape was marked less by pirate hideouts and more by growing nationalism, political unrest, and movements toward independence. The ghosts of the Golden Age now drifted through memory rather than reality. Instead, their stories became raw materials for artists, musicians, and storytellers who reshaped them into cultural symbols. Even in modern times, pirate mythology remains powerful across the Caribbean. Festivals, parades, and tourist attractions celebrate pirate heritage, sometimes with accuracy, sometimes with whimsy. Local storytellers still whisper tales about hidden gold, cursed coves, or phantom ships. And the black flag, once a sign of terror, is now a popular emblem on t-shirts, rum bottles, and tourist trinkets. But behind all this imagery is the deeper truth we've been exploring throughout this series. Piracy was born from the brutal systems of empire, grew in the cracks of colonial oppression, and died when those systems tightened their grip. It was never the fantasy portrayed by Hollywood. It was a fierce, fleeting moment of defiance that captured the imagination of a world hungry for stories about freedom. And even today, we remain captivated because pirates symbolized something timeless, the dream of rejecting unjust authority, even at great cost. If you're enjoying how these chapters reveal not just the pirates themselves, but the world they touched and the myth they became, feel free to stick around, subscribe, or like to support more long-form explorations like this. The next chapters will take us deeper into how pirate memory influenced later Caribbean movements and how the world finally sealed the Golden Age into legend. As the Caribbean moved into the 19th century, the world that had once allowed piracy to flourish was fading beyond recognition. The seas were no longer the turbulent domain of outlaw captains, and the islands were no longer frontier outposts struggling for control. Instead, they had become deeply entrenched nodes in the European imperial machine. Sugar plantations expanded, colonial administrations grew more authoritative, and the slave trade reached its cruel and relentless peak before its eventual abolition. Yet even amid this transformation, the legacy of the pirates, their stories, symbols, impacts, and unintended consequences, continued to ripple through Caribbean life, influencing everything from revolutions to culture to identity. It is tempting to imagine that once the last pirate ships were destroyed or captured, their influence ended. But history is rarely so neat. Pirates may have vanished from the surface of the sea, but their imprint on the Caribbean remained embedded in the lives of sailors, smugglers, rebels, maroons, and even colonial officials who spent decades redefining the boundaries of power. To truly understand the end of the Golden Age, one must move past the image of a final battle and instead trace how the memory of pirates affected the Caribbean long after their physical presence disappeared. One of the most significant ways piracy's legacy manifested was in the shifting relationship between the Caribbean and Europe. During the height of the Golden Age, pirates disrupted trade routes, seized merchant ships, and undermined the authority of imperial governments. Their mere existence forced European powers to invest in naval expansion, coastal fortifications, and colonial bureaucracy. These changes endured and shaped the modern Caribbean. Naval stations in Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, Cuba, and Puerto Rico became permanent fixtures, influencing the island's economies and politics long after the pirate threat faded. These stations also brought European soldiers, administrators, and merchants whose descendants would form part of the Caribbean's diverse population. Ironically, the colonial world that replaced piracy was far more oppressive for many people who lived in the Caribbean. Pirates, despite their violence and unpredictability, operated in a world where class and race mattered less than loyalty and skill. On a pirate ship, enslaved Africans could become free men, Europeans could lose their status, and authority could be challenged. In contrast, the plantation system reinforced rigid social hierarchies. It created a world where race dictated destiny, where class determined rights, and where the rule of law served the interests of the wealthy. As the golden age of piracy disappeared, these inequalities became even more entrenched. This shift helps explain why pirate stories persisted so strongly among the Caribbean's oppressed populations. For enslaved people, for indentured laborers, for the poor, pirates were not merely criminals. They were symbols of resistance, escape, and the possibility of overturning oppressive structures. In the collective imagination, pirate ships represented spaces where a different kind of life could exist. This symbolic power would become especially important as the Caribbean inched closer to major uprisings and revolutions. One of the most dramatic of these uprisings, the Haitian Revolution, erupted in 1791. Though it emerged from the unique conditions of Saint-Domingue, its brutal plantations, its population imbalance, and its political upheaval, the revolution echoed certain themes from the pirate age. Haitian revolutionaries rejected European authority, fought with guerrilla tactics, navigated the Caribbean with deep knowledge of its geography, and defied the expectations of the world. The revolution produced leaders like Toussaint Louverture, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, and Henry Christophe, figures who challenged the global hierarchy just as pirates once had, but with far greater impact. Haiti's success transformed the Caribbean and terrified colonial powers, demonstrating that rebellion was not a relic of the past, but a force capable of reshaping history. Though pirates did not cause the Haitian Revolution, the Caribbean's long tradition of resistance, of which piracy had been a visible part, helped create the cultural environment in which such a dramatic upheaval could take place. Stories of outlaws who once thumbed their noses at Europe had long circulated among enslaved communities. These stories fed a vision of possibility, a belief that rebellion could succeed. The torch of defiance passed from ship decks to plantations, from hidden coves to mountain strongholds, from grog-filled taverns to revolutionary councils. Even after Haiti's victory, the Caribbean remained unsettled. Smaller slave uprisings broke out on other islands. In Jamaica, Sam Sharp led a massive rebellion in 1831, one that contributed directly to the abolition of slavery in the British Empire. In Barbados, the Bussa Rebellion challenged colonial authority. Throughout the region, the fight for freedom was carried by men and women who knew that the Caribbean's history had repeatedly shown that empire was not invincible. Meanwhile, the maritime world continued to evolve. Smuggling grew in importance, particularly as empires tried to control trade more tightly. Smugglers moved rum, sugar, gunpowder, weapons, and enslaved Africans across borders, evading customs officials who were often overworked, underpaid, or corrupt. Many of the techniques once used by pirates, sailing shallow draft vessels, hiding goods in mangrove creeks, forging documents, became central to smuggling operations. In this way, the tactics of piracy outlived the pirates themselves. The Caribbean also saw the rise of privateering again in the early 19th century, especially during the Napoleonic Wars. These privateers were technically legal, but their behavior often blurred the line between legitimate warfare and opportunistic piracy. In some cases, captured ships were looted even when such actions violated the letter of their commissions. Spanish-American revolutionaries, fighting against Spain for independence, also employed privateers who operated in waters once famous for pirate activity. The region once again became a place where government-sanctioned raiders sailed side by side with illegal ones, creating a world reminiscent of the late 17th century. Across Europe and North America, pirate mythology became deeply entwined with popular entertainment. Traveling storytellers recited pirate tales, newspapers sensationalized old accounts, and children's books portrayed buccaneers as adventurous anti-heroes. This shift was partly driven by nostalgia for a wilder world that no longer existed. People living in increasingly industrialized societies romanticized the freedom of men who once lived outside the reach of government. Writers embellished facts to create narratives of treasure hunts, daring sword fights, and fantastical islands far removed from the bleak realities of Caribbean slavery and colonial exploitation. The continued fascination with pirates also reflected a deeper human desire, the longing for freedom in a world that increasingly demanded conformity. As the 19th century progressed, societies became more regulated, policed, and structured. Pirates offered a counter-narrative, a fantasy of escape, rebellion, and individuality. This fantasy endured even as new technologies, steamships, telegraphs, railways, made the world smaller and less mysterious. In the Caribbean itself, communities continued telling pirate stories as part of local identity. In the Bahamas, tales of Blackbeard's hidden gold persisted. In Cuba, stories of pirate attacks on coastal villages blended with memories of colonial conflict. In Jamaica, ballads about Anne Bonny and Mary Read circulated in certain quarters. In Haiti, old rumors of French privateer treasure merged with Vodou legends. These stories, shaped by centuries of retelling, became part of the region's cultural tapestry. By the late 19th century, the Caribbean was no longer the center of maritime rebellion, but the memory of piracy remained embedded in tourism, folklore, and even political rhetoric. Some local leaders invoked pirate imagery to symbolize defiance against foreign control. Others embraced pirate heritage as part of island branding, creating festivals and events celebrating pirate days. This transformation, from feared criminals to cultural icons, reveals how deeply the pirate myth had taken root. In academic circles, historians began re-examining piracy from a more serious perspective. Instead of dismissing pirates as simple criminals, scholars explored their social structures, political implications, and economic impacts. They discovered that pirate codes were more sophisticated than previously thought, that pirate ships were radical spaces of equality, and that piracy's legacy reached far beyond plunder. This resurgence of interest helped restore a sense of historical depth to pirate studies, grounding the myths in real human experiences. And yet, for all this renewed attention, the core of pirate appeal remained the same as it had been hundreds of years earlier. Pirates represented freedom, dangerous, imperfect, fleeting, but undeniably compelling. They lived outside systems that oppressed the many and rewarded the few. Their lives were harsh, violent, and unstable, but they chose them. And in that choice, they embodied something that resonated with generations of people who felt trapped by their own societies. As we prepare to move to the final chapter of this long exploration, it's amazing to see how the story of real pirates has traveled across centuries, across cultures, across oceans, shifting from reality to myth, from lived rebellion to symbolic freedom. If you've enjoyed this deep dive all the way into Chapter 9, thank you for staying with the journey. And if you'd like to support more long-form documentary-style stories like this, feel free to subscribe, like, or follow along. It genuinely helps keep this type of storytelling alive. The sun sets differently in the Caribbean than in most places on Earth. The sky doesn't simply darken, it transforms. Colors bleed across the horizon like spilled paint, deep crimson, fierce orange, violet dissolving into endless blue. For centuries, sailors watched these sunsets with the same mixture of awe and concern, because beauty at sea often comes with danger. Storms could sweep in behind a sunset, unseen in the glowing sky. And it was under skies like these that the final shadows of the old pirate world faded, leaving behind a region profoundly shaped by an era that lasted only a few decades but influenced centuries. The golden age of piracy ended long before the 19th century opened, yet its impact reverberated through the Caribbean long afterward. By the early 1800s, the seas were largely controlled by European navies, trade routes were heavily monitored, and piracy, true piracy, the kind that once dared to blockade Charleston or raid Panama, was nearly impossible. But the Caribbean never forgot. Too much blood had been spilled, too many legends born, too many myths woven into the fabric of everyday life. And in the centuries that followed, those memories would take on lives of their own. Before exploring the long-term legacy, it's worth considering why the Golden Age ended at all, because the reasons reveal far more about the world than about the pirates themselves. Empires grew stronger, naval technology improved, colonial economies demanded stability. Plantation owners needed secure trade routes to ship sugar, rum, and coffee. European governments no longer tolerated freebooters who disrupted their expanding profits. Even the chaotic colonial administrations that had once secretly accepted pirate bribes were replaced by stricter systems of governance. All these changes created a Caribbean where pirates had no place to hide, no ports that would welcome them, no governors willing to look the other way. The world had changed, and the pirates could not change with it. Yet the legend of pirates did not fade. In fact, their legend grew even larger as their actual presence vanished. This paradox, pirates becoming more famous after they disappeared than when they dominated the seas, helps explain the enduring magnetism of their story. Pirates came to represent something powerful in the human imagination, resistance to control, a desire for freedom, a refusal to submit to injustice. Of course, real pirates were far more complicated. They were thieves, fighters, opportunists, fugitives, democrats, murderers, visionaries, and rebels, bundled into one tangle of contradictions. But contradictions often make for the best stories. In the Caribbean, these stories took on a life of their own. Consider the small islands where the bones of forgotten pirates still lie buried beneath shifting sands. Local fishermen tell tales of strange lights on the water, of ghostly ships that appear at dusk, of shadowy figures walking beaches where no one should be walking. Some stories focus on hidden treasure, gold buried in sea caves, silver dropped into wells, jewels concealed in the roots of old mangrove trees. Whether such treasure really exists hardly matters. The belief in treasure is the treasure. It keeps the pirate legacy alive in a way that no museum exhibit or history book could manage on its own. Haiti, Jamaica, Barbados, the Bahamas, Cuba, all developed their own variations of pirate folklore. In Jamaica, storytellers merged pirate myths with African oral traditions, creating tales where pirate ghosts were bound to the spiritual world, forever rowing phantom boats through coastal waters. In the Bahamas, Blackbeard became as much a supernatural figure as a historical one, with stories claiming his headless body still swims through the shallows of Ocracoke. In Haiti, pirate legends interacted with Vodou belief systems, transforming certain pirate captains into restless spirits in the collective memory. In Cuba, the tales mixed with Spanish legends of corsairs and privateers who once defended imperial interests. These stories, blending African, European, and indigenous influences, became distinctly Caribbean, a region where the past is never truly gone, but always walking alongside the present. Meanwhile, the academic world also began taking a closer interest in real pirates. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians, archaeologists, and researchers started peeling back the myths, revealing the truth behind the legends. Shipwrecks were discovered and excavated. The wider Sam Bellamy's vessel yielded thousands of artifacts, from cannons and cutlasses to buttons and coins. Blackbeard's Queen Anne's Revenge, found near North Carolina, revealed medical tools, navigational instruments, and remnants of the daily life aboard a pirate ship. These findings painted a picture of pirates not as supernatural marauders, but as human beings driven by the brutal realities of their time. They suffered from disease, malnutrition, injuries, and constant uncertainty. They lived short lives, usually only a few years after turning pirate. But those few years were intense, chaotic, and lived on their own terms. When historians uncovered evidence of pirates' codes, compensation rules, and elected leadership, the narrative shifted again. Pirates were not merely criminals, they were participants in an early form of egalitarianism that challenged the authoritarian systems surrounding them. This reinterpretation mattered because it forced modern society to confront uncomfortable truths. Why did so many sailors prefer the dangerous life of piracy over the supposedly civilized structures of European society? Why did men willingly join crews where death was almost guaranteed? The answer, of course, was oppression. Sailors felt trapped by harsh naval discipline, abusive merchant captains, and rigid class hierarchies. Pirates offered an escape, however temporary. Their brief societies at sea were imperfect experiments, but they were experiments nonetheless, struggling attempts to create spaces where each man had some dignity, some voice, some share of wealth. The irony, then, is that while Europe saw pirates as threats, many sailors saw them as opportunities. Over time, pirate narratives began influencing broader social movements. Ideas about equality aboard pirate ships echoed in later discussions about human rights, workers' rights, and governance. Though pirates had no direct connection to democratic revolutions, the stories of their shipboard voting and equal shares seeped into cultural memory, contributing to a larger suspicion of absolute authority. Eventually, the Caribbean itself began to rethink how pirates fit into its own identity. Rather than viewing them solely as European criminals, many island nations embraced piracy as part of their unique heritage. Pirate festivals emerged in the Bahamas and Cayman Islands. Museums dedicated exhibits to the Golden Age. Schools taught units on Caribbean maritime history. And tourism, ever hungry for narratives, found rich material in pirate legends. Visitors came seeking pirate forts, pirate coves, pirate relics. They came to sail the waters once prowled by Blackbeard and Roberts. They came to drink rum in taverns styled after Nassau's old dens. Whether these reconstructions were historically accurate mattered less than the fact that they connected people to the region's history, however indirectly. Pirates had become cultural ambassadors from the past, but beneath all this, there remains a deeper truth. Piracy was born from hardship, exploitation, and conflict. These forces still exist in various forms across the Caribbean today. Economic inequality, foreign influence, environmental challenges, and struggles for autonomy continue to shape the islands. The pirate legacy reminds us that rebellion is woven into Caribbean history, not because people loved chaos, but because they demanded dignity. And so, when we speak of the real pirates of the Caribbean, we are not merely recounting tales of violence or adventure. We are recounting a story about freedom, temporary, risky, flawed, and sometimes destructive freedom, but freedom nonetheless. The pirates did not overthrow empires, but they challenged their authority. They did not free the enslaved masses, but they created spaces where people of diverse backgrounds could stand as equals. They did not build nations, but they inspired generations to question the legitimacy of power. This documentary journey, tracing the rise, reign, and legacy of the Caribbean pirates, reveals how human lives, however flawed, shape history in ways that outlive them. Their ships rotted, their bones vanished, their flags fell. but their impact endured, twisting through the centuries like a rope binding past to present. And if you've followed this story all the way to the end, thank you. Bringing these long-form histories to life takes time, curiosity, and support from people who enjoy exploring the real stories behind the myths. If you'd like more deep-dive documentary scripts like this on ancient civilizations, forgotten wars, lost cultures, or hidden corners of history, feel free to subscribe, like, or follow along in whatever platform you're using. It genuinely helps keep these histories alive and encourages more series like this one. The golden age of piracy may be over, but its stories sail on. Its ghosts still haunt the Caribbean winds. Its legends drift across the waves. And somewhere, in the imagination of every traveler who looks out over those blue waters and wonders what lies beyond the horizon, a pirate still lives.